Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series. Thank you so much for joining us. Our guest today is T.L. Taylor, who is an associate professor and does games research at the university over in Copenhagen. And I'm just so pleased that I was able to snag her on one of her trips to the States to come up and chat with us. She's written a really fascinating book about online game culture and has just done some of, I think it seems to be a quickly emerging part of academic life these days, not only because so many kids are playing games that enough professors are sort of taking note that, oh, this might be an interesting thing, but also folks are doing fascinating research on using games in educational circumstances or using games to communicate cross-culturally. And TL has just done some fascinating work, and I'm so pleased that she could come up and chat with us today. So please help me welcome Dr. Taylor.
Okay, thanks very much for the invitation to come here, and it's nice to see some friends and hopefully meet some new people, and I'm looking forward to a discussion at the end as well, so I'll try to not drone on and on. So thanks for the invitation to come here. I thought this is just kind of a quick rundown of where I imagine going for the next 40 minutes or so, 30, 40 minutes. And just to start with the bit about who I am, as Tamara said, I work at the IT University in Copenhagen, where we have a Center for Computer Games Research. We've been really fortunate to be an institution that has kind of thrown their support, and not only their support, but they've actually funded our endeavors. You know, sometimes it's one thing to say you support something, it's another to give it money. So they've let us set up a Center for Computer Games Research. We have a study program where we're bringing in people who really, in a lot of ways, just want to be game designers. But we have PhD students studying game culture, game design, all sorts of aspects as well. I'm, as you can probably tell from the accent, though, an American. I went over there 2.5 years ago. I'm a qualitative sociologist. I did my graduate training in the Boston area at a university called Brandeis University. And I started doing my work really on internet study stuff in the 1990s. And I started in the bulletin board scene and ended up in massive multiplayer online game, dungeons, MUDs, text-based worlds. And I spent some time as well, we were just talking earlier about the HIT Lab, in the kind of world of VR that was emerging in the 1990s and very hyped and people were excited about. And what happened really is that as I was finishing my dissertation, I was so sick of it that I wanted a distraction, and I found myself in Everquest, which often happens, and then it quickly became the next research project, which often happens. But the more I've thought about it over the years, it makes a lot of sense, of course. It's part of that natural story that I think we've seen emerging. So, and in that regard, I suppose what I bring to game studies as well, too, is this foot in internet culture studies and internet studies and thinking about the relationship between games don't just kind of exist in this little pocket outside of all the things we've learned about online communities and internet studies over the last, 16 years? So I think I sort of bring those things together. So today I'm going to talk to you mostly about Everquest, though I've thrown in a few World of Warcraft slides at the end. How many people are World of Warcraft players? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. And how many people have spent time in a massive multiplayer online game in some sense? Okay, so it's a fairly... All right, so forgive me if some of this is a little basic. I'll try not to kind of bog down with too many rudimentary things. And exactly, but I'm going to try to sort of bog down enough to keep us all on the same page. But this work is really from the Everquest stuff that I did, and that I started in 1999, and I spent, well, somebody asked me if I still play. I don't play anymore. I still have an account, which is a classic. You can't quite let it go. I mean, if any of you are game developers, figure out how we can leave these worlds in interesting ways, right? Like, because clearly we want to leave, but just sort of closing the account is not quite the right thing. Yeah. But I spent probably 4 years actively researching that world, and that means playing alongside people, going to Fan Faire, interviewing people, I got lucky and snagged Brad McQuaid for a little bit of conversation about the design process. So really trying to be involved in that scene, and also spending a lot of time at third-party websites, which by the end of this talk I'm going to try to make a case for you that we shouldn't just think of EverQuest as that boxed product that comes off the shelf. So really trying to be involved in this broad ethnography of the world. And of course the punchline is the book that just came out. What are MMOGs? I don't have a I was debating whether or not to show you a movie. I just didn't want to take up too much time. I have a few screenshots. This is just a rough rundown of some of the main characteristics of these games. For those of you who haven't played, what we're talking about primarily are graphical virtual worlds. Of course, I'm still a big believer that MUDs still are immersive virtual worlds, so I don't want to lose that in this discussion. But what's really quite popular right now are these graphical, often three-dimensional, quite often three-dimensional virtual worlds. And part of my interest in exploring game culture is always keeping an eye on the history stuff, so I think it's very important to keep in mind the ways things like WoW, EverQuest, all of these genres have their roots in tabletop gaming and have their roots in this text-based genre, so that's where they come from. But we're talking about worlds filled with creatures, landscapes, avatars, and you're in there simultaneously with other players, questing, fighting. The fantasy themes still are pretty predominant, so there's often people casting magic and wielding swords, and still a very common genre. You buy a software product, but then you pay a monthly subscription fee. And the way these games work, well, EverQuest was 1999, is still around online. 1997, I'll show you a screenshot. So what happens is you buy this initial product, but you're constantly buying new upgrades and expansions, if you stay around, of course, and paying a monthly subscription fee. So they're software and service products, and I think that's a kind of interesting mix for us to talk about. So I have just a couple screenshots to show you so you at least have a picture in mind. This is really one of it. Telling histories is a complicated business, right? So I don't want to say this is the first. It's certainly not. But this is one of the ones that was really a breakthrough title. So this is Ultima Online. And in fact, a lot of the things that we see now when we hand-wring over intellectual property debates and selling characters, and so all this stuff was happening in Ultima Online then. So there's a much longer continuum of history here. Then we have EverQuest in 1999, and this looks very different than the world that I started playing in 1999. They completely updated their graphics. And then most recently, World of Warcraft in 2004, and in Europe 2005. And there's a really nice site. He hasn't updated his charts in a while. People often wonder how many people are playing these games. So if you go to mmogchart.com, this guy, Bruce, does somebody catch last name? Sir Bruce is what he goes by. He tries to put together subscription data for these things so we can kind of get a sense of how many people are playing. You'll notice that World of Warcraft is the one that just shoots straight up, and these figures are out of date. I don't know, maybe some of you WoW players can even chime in with the most current 6.5 million, right? So quite a few, worldwide, quite a few people are playing, and especially if you sort of go back and look at some of the early days. Sorry, I'm sort of on this side for those of you over there.
Is that active players or just people?
This is the big debate, so of course I'm sort of bracketing. People have very different ways they want to measure it. Some want to measure active subscriptions. Rough Coster says the best way to measure it is to sort of see how many people are logging in on a per weekly basis. So I give these to you more as a rough estimate to get a sense of the emerging population in those spaces. Okay. So when Tamar invited me, and as I was thinking about coming here to speak, it's very hard to know what to distill out of a book. So I'm going to just try to give you one strand, one thread. But, if you want to have conversations about things I'm not hitting on, because I try to cover quite a range of topics in the book. But for today, I thought we might mostly spend our time talking about sort of the social context of play and networks, collaboration in teams, and what I'm going to call co-creative culture, or the idea of players being productive in their play communities. And so if we start by thinking about social life in these game worlds, of course, I think it's becoming more and more common for people to understand games as not asocial spaces, right? We play with each other in those worlds. But I want to suggest something a little bit stronger. I want to suggest that the social and cultural nature of games and gameplay is crucial to their being pleasurable, to their being fun, and to the reason people keep going back for them. So I don't want to sort of say like the social is the icing on the cake, and if you take away the icing, you'll still have a really good cake there. I actually want to say it's the thing that holds the cake together. So I really want to centralize it. And I want to, hopefully, in this quick amount of time, also try to suggest that I'm not just talking about chat. I really want to talk about the complex social processes that happen in these worlds, the amazing systems of coordination, teamwork, and collaboration that occur there. So I want to kind of really centralize the social and also really give a complex, or at least suggest a complex picture of the social. And I think, you know, even though I study games right now, in general, or more broadly, I'm a person who's interested in the relationship between the social and technological artifacts. And I think games are a great way to begin to unpack and discover that relationship. So in this regard, I'm going to try to quickly say a little bit about off and online connections, this idea of ported communities and emergent norms. And please feel free to stop me, because I can tell I zoom. So just stop me if I go a little too fast. All right. The first thing I want to suggest to you as a way of pushing past the kind of just chat. Oh, thank you.
Do you think that the people, when they play online, they're playing their real personality? I mean, the person you're playing with, do they actually act like that in real life?
I'm going to give you the worst answer possible. I think it's very complicated. I think some people can make that separation. In my experience, some people try to make the separation and find they can't. Other people find they grow into it, so I think it's really a range. And I think we always have to consider the ways to specific games, specific technologies foster or limit those kinds of performances. So, you know, one of the things, I don't know if you noticed, you know, I think I use it on here. I use the acronym MMOG, Massively Multiplayer Online Game. There was a time when we said Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game. And in fact, when you first look at these games, you might think, well, everybody should be role-playing in themselves. And in fact, that doesn't happen. For lots of complicated reasons, some of which I think are social, some of which I think are psychological, and some of which are technological, systems that don't facilitate role-play. So I'm giving you a kind of mixed answer on that one. Okay, so the first thing I want to suggest is that players don't simply pick up a game, sit down with it, and immediately play it to its fullest, understand it to its fullest, and just, you know, kind of flip through the manual and get it. Part of what playing involves is becoming a player, becoming socialized in the practices of play. There's a lot of indeterminacy in these games. And I don't know if any of you are working on console games or other genres, but I think it would be very interesting to think about indeterminacy in those systems as well. But there's a lot of stuff in Everquest, for example, that is not specified in the manual, and the community has had to make sense of it, come up with strategies for play in interesting ways. And so I want to suggest to you, in the same way that offline we create norms, social practices, forms of social regulation, right? We sort of figure out what you should and shouldn't do, and if you break the rules, you get, you know, you can be outed. That this happens in game worlds as well. I have a little bit of a goofy picture up here for you, and it's my very mundane, trivial example, but maybe I'll say a few words about it. This is what's called in Everquest a train. And if any of you know about trains, there's a few laughs, which is part of my point, actually. What trains are basically somebody's in the zone, they're fighting monsters, and they collect a huge number of them, right? And they start running. And they have this huge number of monsters following behind them. Okay. And the thing about in Everquest, the interesting thing is some game systems have now designed this feature out. In Everquest 2, you can't do the same kind of train thing, but people create these trains. If you look in the manual, there's nothing there to explain what are you supposed to do as a player when that happens. It doesn't mention trains. It doesn't say what you're supposed to do. And the community has, in the face of that, developed a remarkably, I think, sophisticated way of understanding these phenomena. And they are a regular, prevalent part of life in that game. And the reason there were a few smiles, those of you who've been in EverQuest know that telling stories about your favorite train or your worst train or the most dramatic train is a part of that world. So for example, with trains, people come up with, well, okay, it was unintentional, the person didn't mean to, oh, and I should say, the thing with trains is if you get that collection of 15 monsters behind you and I run at you, you're going to get caught in the train, right? You're going to get slaughtered as well. So what happens is people have come up with norms about calling out when a train is happening and saying where it's going so people can get out of the way. Right? So, and it happens all the time, you know, sort of, I'm heading to the zone line, everybody clear out or you're going to get it. But people have also come up with ways of making sense of these events. So sometimes they say, well, it was unintentional, but I can see how it happened. You know, when I was a newbie and I was in this zone, that happened to me all the time. Sometimes they say it was unintentional, but it was dumb. You were just a bad player. So they're making these, here's the phenomenon, they're making these judgments about it. Another one is they say it was intentional and it was grief play, right? So in the server I studied, it wasn't a player versus player server, which means I have to use the environment if I want to get it back at you. So people would create trains and run them to the person they wanted to kill. So that object becomes grief play suddenly, right? Unintentional or intentional and strategic. I'm a really good player. I don't want to kill one, kill one, kill one. I want to get 50 together and boom, take them all down. Yeah?
Do you feel grief play has become a social norm on online games? You say what grief play is?
Thanks. Okay, yeah, sorry, thanks. Grief play, I suppose the simplest way of thinking about it is mischievous behavior directed at another player.
Sociopath.
Well, yeah. Some certainly feel that way. And I can tell you when I'm on a PvP server in WoW, and when I've been killed repeatedly by somebody and they're standing over my corpse, laughing and spitting on it, it's hard not to feel it's sociopathic, of course. I think there's a range. And grief play is really one of the most contested parts of game culture because there are a lot of things people do that are right on the borders. I mean, cheating is like this. People are often unsure if something is cheating or not. And so that kind of gray area is, again, for me as a sociologist, it's very interesting to watch communities sort that out and come up with systems to make sense of and practices to make sense of the gray areas. So I don't know if that helps sort of the grief play thing. Okay. Yeah. And then, of course, the other thing that happens with these trains is, as I said, they become points of humor and memory. You can go online and read pages about people posting their favorite trains. Now, it's a trivial example, of course, right? I mean, it's sort of this thing that happens in the world. But I use it because I want to highlight that people, when they enter into EverQuest, don't know any of those systems of meaning. They have to, over time, learn what to do when they get a train. They have to learn how to make sense and evaluate other trains. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but a huge part of what people do in EverQuest is evaluate other players. You know, are you a good player? Are you a bad player? Are you trustworthy? Are you responsible? Or do I want to have you around? And so this becomes part of the social work, the social labor people do in that space. There's lots of other examples. I won't go into them, but things like looting conventions. How do you know who should get what loot? The whole emergence of markets in games are often very emergent kind of developments. So again, talking about something as social is not just about chat. It's about all that work people and communities do to make a space inhabitable and make it, I think, lively. The only other plug I'll say for this is for those of you who do research, I think these kinds of incidents are a methodological challenge to us because it means you can't look at a train and know what it means. Right? You can't just sort of observe the phenomena and walk away and sort of say, okay, blah, blah, blah. You actually have to figure out the context, the situation, and how the community makes sense of it. So it's maybe a little plug for those of us who do ethnographic work, anthropological work, working with users. That's a really important part of understanding that phenomenon. Okay, the next thing I just want to say a little bit about, because it's such a big part of these games, are the formal organizations that occur in them. And these are guilds. They can go by different names, but I mean, guilds is probably probably one of the most common. And what these are formal collectives of people who've chosen to group together. They usually have a tag over their name that shows a shared identity and affiliation. And it's important to note that there are lots of different types of guilds. Again, I want to highlight the social complexity here. So it's not just that there are guilds in games. There are what are called family guilds, social guilds, raiding guilds, casual guilds. I mean, a whole range. Guilds that segregate by age, guilds that segregate by nationality, guilds that intend to be cross-cultural, a whole range. And so there's a very kind of diverse context for people joining together, banding together, and doing work, playing the game together. And the interesting thing, a colleague and I wrote a paper several years ago, snippets of which influence are part of this book, where we tried to sort of playfully compare the EverQuest to the Sopranos and the Mafia, and suggest that some of the most prevalent things you see in guild structures and in these games in general are forms of trust, responsibility, accountability, and reputation. That these things matter powerfully. And in fact, at the high end of the game, it is really quite difficult to even keep playing if you haven't been socialized into a guild in some way, brought into this space, gained some kind of reputation standing. It could be a bad reputation. It's not that we're talking necessarily good reputation. Maybe you're part of the renegade guild. But nonetheless, you really become a part of that world. And people spend a lot of time relying on others and evaluating whether or not these are folks that they want to hang out with. And the interesting thing I think about guilds, too, is that I think we keep going through, I don't know, waves in internet studies. In the beginning, there was this idea that you went online and you sort of only met strangers. And now we're starting to see people porting, and we have always had this, but I think the scale is maybe increasing, porting offline relationships into these spaces. So on the picture here, you'll see I've tried to do a rough mapping of one of the small social family guilds I was in. And it was an interesting exercise to sit down and actually start trying to connect, well, who knew who in this guild? And what you see, maybe it's a little blurry, what you see is that you have married couples playing together, offline friends playing together, people who became friends in the game world and then became friends offline. So they're this kind of interesting hybrid category. Families playing together. And I think this is one of the most exciting emerging things, for us to kind of turn our attention to is how do our offline social relationships and networks get integrated, ported into these spaces, and how does that shape play in particular ways? And I thought to maybe just illustrate this, I was going to ask for 6 volunteers to read for us. This is a little snippet of dialogue. So can I have 6 volunteers? One person to be the Beast Lord character. Thank you, great. And a caster. Thanks, Liz. A ranger. Thank you. A magician. Thanks. A warrior. Who can be a warrior for us, please? Someone. Thank you very much. And a cleric is the last one. Okay, thanks. So the scene is EverQuest. As you'll see in the first line, the party has had sort of a bad incident, and there were some deaths. And we'll take it from there and see what we can unpack. So maybe if the caster can start this.
Do you want the acronyms?
Yeah, okay, this is a little bit tricky. Why don't, there's a lot of acronyms here. Maybe just read it straight and then give us the quick kind of, laughing out loud or whatever it means. Okay. If you don't know, we'll help you.
Crap. Ouch.
Don't move.
O-O-N. Means out of mana. Sorry, Ranger. It's okay.
Who's the warrior?
Did you die, Ranger?
Yes, he did. Pull the cast.
Hold on, let me see if my boyfriend's cleric is in the zone.
We definitely need a heal.
Ask Ranger if he's ready for res.
Ranger, you ready for res?
Yeah.
Welcome.
Welcome back to the living. Laughing out loud.
Too bad my warrior and his clerics have to save my cat.
Man, my husband just got killed in a bad place and can't get to his body or res. Where is hubby? He's
Asking.
He's upset.
Who's the warrior again?
Why?
Talking at the moment because he may not be able to get his body back. Where did he die? He's not saying. I know it's near Burning Woods. Could a 60 ranger get it? He was 52. I think he lost his level.
That's bad.
If he needs help, I can summon his corpse.
I got a 57 cleric too. He thinks he got one. Okay, well I can resin with my son's cleric and hopefully brag with my ranger. What level cleric? 57? Okay, I told him. Our pewters are not in the same place, so we talk through tells a lot too.
Thanks. All right. Okay, you can clearly see it. There's a lot going on in this snippet, right? And one of the points I really want to highlight for you is there's not a one-to-one correlation between player and character. That players have this amazing social network that they can call on to make sense, to make that play space work. And so you see that here. It's a little bit of a rough graphic, but I'm just trying to give you a little taste of it. I think we have this in our updated version of the paper where we try to begin to map out, who has access and who owns who and who can you bring into the fold. And so the way these networks aren't just in-game networks but also cross into out-game relationships, and people can marshal them. So these multiple connections, offline characters, and access. Now the one thing I want to highlight here is it's a little unclear from the transcript, but one of the common things that happens in MMOGs is that people who have access to characters that aren't their own. Now, if you read your end-user license agreement, it will tell you you're not allowed to give your password and user account name to anybody else. In fact, it's usually a bannable offense. So what I think is quite interesting is that in this space, emergent play practices always tend towards this kind of access sharing. It's always based on reputation and trust. I'm not saying people are handing out passwords, but it's at odds with the formal design, the formal imagination of what users should be doing in that space. And this is a long, broader discussion about how designers and legal departments, more importantly, imagine their technology should be used and how actual users engage with them. And this is something that we continue to see a gap on with these end-user license agreements. But you can see here this complicated relationship to things. And it's a little bit the punchline for the title of that book, my book, Play Between Worlds, because I think that's one of the most interesting things that's happening in those spaces. All right. The setup, of course, is you have all these social networks, you have this kind of marshaling of resources, and not surprisingly, what you see happen is a lot of collaboration and teamwork, especially at the high end of these games, to make things happen. So for those of you who don't play, in the beginning in Everquest, you pretty immediately get involved with what are called pickup groups. You sort of find other people to hang out with and do stuff with. Some people talk about how WoW is this kind of interesting anomaly because you can get quite far only soloing off by yourself. But in EverQuest, it was very hard to not eventually really get into the group scene. And at the high end, to actually to actually succeed or play the high end of the game, you have to be in groups. We're talking 40-person raid events that are very complicated, very scripted. In fact, we can have this discussion if you want, but I sort of at times want to make a claim that we're really talking about semi-pro sports. If you look at high-end guilds and how they really are operating. But there's a lot of coordinated action to solve complex problems, and a lot of what I would call collective knowledge. Now, I think it's pretty easy to look at things like guilds and that kind of teamwork and talk about collaboration and coordination. I want to again make a little bit broader case. Because I think one of the interesting things we see in these spaces is this huge proliferation of third-party websites, applications, modifications, add-on, that all shape, tweak, extend the bounds of the game. So you get massive databases where I'm just showing you pictures of a couple here, and again, for you WoW players, you probably can think of all the substitution websites. Well, Alakazam actually serves the WoW community, but WoW does the same thing. A huge amount of databases and websites to help players. So what happens is you're in the game, you get an item that's never been seen before in the game, you run off to the website, you input it, you share that information, where you got it, how to get it, maybe not immediately, because sometimes there's something about having exclusive goods and tips and techniques, but eventually you share it. And so players create this vast web of resources to assist play. It's a little bit of a provocative point, and again, we can talk about it, but I actually think at some point this stuff becomes invaluable. Like, you actually can't play the game without all this stuff. Or at least we've become so used to having all this stuff that playing the game without it seems kind of unimaginable. I've been interviewing lately high-end raid leaders in WoW and talking to them about, would you pull out all of your UI modifications when you go on your high-end raids? And, well, we could. And one guy had this great anecdote about how in Everquest they used to sit there with a timer and clock things, and now they have a modification in WoW that lets them do it. So he said, well, I guess we could go back to using the stopwatch, but would we really want to do that anymore? So I want to make an argument that this kind of stuff produces, thanks.
Do you find that games such as Second Life, which allow the users to create content, don't have the same emergent social culture?
I don't study Second Life, so I don't know. I mean, I think if I channeled Corey, who's one of the sort of VP guys, I think he would say yes. I mean, I think it's hard for me to imagine, though. It's hard for me to imagine any group of people not producing emergent, interesting culture. I mean, that's sort of what we have to do when we're placed with each other, technology or not. So I don't know what it looks like.
In fact, we got Corey here. And
okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Corey and Draco, yeah. And they have a huge builder community, which is different than these games. Yeah.
In these games, how much of the reward structure is through explicit programming in the game, like it's watching you,
right,
it rewards you?
Yeah.
How much is players sort of giving props to other players?
That's a great question. Well, certainly, one of the interesting things about WoW, at least, is you have a huge number of players who've, at least according to the system, gotten to level 6. They've done it all. They've gone as far as they can in levels, and they're still playing. And in part, part of it is having better and better equipment, which of course people notice. If you hang out in the main towns, people inspect each other, and sort of the thrill of progressing and conquest, killing monsters that nobody else has killed. So I think it's an interesting question about how much the system kind of gives you props and how much it comes from the community and sort of this kind of collective idea of progress. Like, okay, we're going to try to defeat this next monster in a certain amount of time. And so it's a kind of a mix, I would say, if that's a satisfactory answer. Yeah. So when you have all of these third-party websites, applications, modifications, and what I want to say too is very important is all that social work. Because I think sometimes when we think about productive players, we only think of, like, have they built something? And I really want to make a case that productivity is the social work people do as well, right? So when you think about all the social work people do to make that, if you want to say it, technology usable, they're very productive. And I think it's interesting to start considering these objects as part of a kind of co-creative culture, in which it's not just that game designers hand down products that get sort of used seamlessly and we can just, it's apparent from the box how it's going to be used, but actually emerge and change over time. And it's hard to track in this quick period of time, but there's an interesting sort of cycle of development, which is as users extend, change, reshape game products, and I think technologies in general, developers, designers pick up some of the innovations and cycle them back into the game. So it's not just this kind of separate, agents at work. There's a kind of interesting loop going on between them. So I think shifting the language to something like players as producers and designers and co-creative culture is one of the interesting provocations, ways we could go. So, the punchline, of course, is, as I said, you pick that, this is the box art from the old Everquest game. You get the box, you take it home, you put it in, and in fact what you find is the game is something much more like this, right? With a range of things that really extend, add to, and make playable that game. And it's not icing. It's crucial stuff. It's central to the game. Okay. I'm almost done, but unless you worry... Oh, let me just give you one other screenshot. I have my few WoW pictures for you here. This is a screenshot from WoW with no user interface modifications added. So one of the interesting things Blizzard has done is they've really opened up their UI so that users can produce modifications to dramatically change and alter what information they're getting in the game. So this is with no mods. In the process of interviewing these raid leaders, I've been asking them to send me screenshots of their interfaces, and here's one. Pretty dramatically different, right? And what I want to suggest to you is, again, this isn't just like, oh, it's handy, he's got some extra info. This change, right? And it's, I mean, the kind of literacy it takes to read that, right? I mean, I can kind of make it out, but this changes gameplay. It's not just kind of fixing the interface. It's changing the experience in important ways. It's changing what it means to play in that space. Yeah.
What level of programming skills are you?
That's a good question. I've only interviewed the group who does the CT mod, which is one of the most used ones. I get the impression from reading, if you go to the website like Cursed Gaming or something, you can look at mods and you can read developers putting in their notes. I get the impression there's a pretty wide range of skills, that some people have pretty rudimentary, and it shows sometimes, and other people are teams working on. So I can't give you a precise answer.
I cannot interrupt.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Which is, it's a very JavaScript-like scripting language, and a rich set of APIs provided. So the degree of sort of complex programming skill necessary is not that high. What it does require really is an understanding of impact on interface, which many people with strong programming skills don't have, and an understanding of underlying data structures, which are provided through XML data structures that are also exposed by Blizzard in many, not for everything, but for key components. So it's a richly scriptable environment, but making the good stuff requires far less in the way of complex programming and much more in the way of interaction.
So it's really a design-oriented interaction rather than a focus-oriented.
And I suppose that the second side to this story, I've just sort of said it changes play in important ways. I'm increasingly thinking about how it changes social life in important ways. I'll go back one screen. Because one of the things that a lot of these mods do is they allow you to get really, refined is not the right word, they allow you to see what everybody's doing at a micro level that you couldn't before. And I'm particularly interested in how that changes social structure and social life in these spaces. So it's not just that, the technology changes games. I think it changes social worlds as well. And that's another part of that loop that we often sort of don't talk about. Okay. I'm almost done, but lest you think I don't want to sort of make this a kind of utopic pitch about the easy future of participatory culture and co-creative, because it's not. And if you look at EverQuest, there have been several moments where, on the one hand, players are often invited to, the EverQuest tagline is, you're in our world now and come live here and spend your life here and develop relationships. And yet there are moments where, what players want to do really clashes with what designers and legal departments want players to do. Whether that's regulating fan fiction, or one of the big issues right now is who owns your avatar. I mean, those of you in the game world know this debate, right? Like, can you sell your avatar on eBay? Years and years ago, EverQuest, Sony made an agreement with eBay that they were not going to allow these things to happen. If you go there today, you'll still see people selling them, and you'll still see that it's a bannable offense, and it's still a contentious issue. And of course, probably one of the interesting changes too is we now have third parties entering into it. So you get a website like IGE who's willing to sort of broker gold between people and sell power leveling and sell you characters. So there's also kind of, it's not just players and designers, it's players, designers, and third parties vying for intellectual property debates and who owns that space, who's the real designer, where does the line get drawn about which kind of mods you want to be able to use. So there are lots of, I think, interesting debates there. And of course, the other thing that I think we still haven't really wrangled with is, are these public or private spaces? What's the nature of regulation and social control in them? So this is the warrior protests from WoW. I don't know, were any of you at this? No, okay. This is from 2005, and what had happened was warriors were very unhappy with their class of character, and they'd been wanting changes to the game, and they'd been posting on bulletin boards and sort of never felt like they got heard. So they said, okay, let's have a protest. And there's a long history in virtual worlds of starting protests. It's a kind of great, I think somebody should do an art show sometime of all the protest pictures we have running out there. So they started a protest. Everybody started level 1 characters, and they went to Ironforge. Okay, so I've pulled this from a webpage. I wasn't there for it, but what happened was the person has the screenshots. This was the message that they were met with. Gathering on a realm with the intent to hinder gameplay is considered griefing, and you'll not be tolerated if you're here for the warrior protest. Please log off and return to playing on your usual realm. And I often say, to me, this is exactly like, the police bullhorn, right? Just go back home, there's nothing here to see. Yeah.
Did you hear about the situation in China where they tried to limit gameplay and like a million World of Warcraft people got together and committed mass suicide?
No, I hadn't heard of that. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's always an interesting debate here because a lot of times, designers and developers will say, we just can't handle that many people in that space. It's a technological issue. And I always think, well, it's interesting which technological things we decide to fix and not. And this issue of sort of mass demonstration, public space, putting people into shared space is, I think, one of the most interesting ones. So, and this, this is prevalent. It keeps happening. And again, at the moment, we're seeing kind of lots of interesting emergent culture. At the moment, game companies are saying, come and live in our world and be here. We also see interesting lines being drawn in the sand about intellectual property and ownership and things like this.
What happened?
Well, the person who I got this screenshot from, and I can give you the URL, they got banned for, I think it was 3 hours. They got kicked out of the system and then were allowed to come back in. The upshot of the class, I don't know if any of you play a warrior class, maybe you'll know if it had any effect. I don't know if they... The purpose was they were unhappy. It's kind of a common thing in games. They were unhappy with the way their character class functioned. So the sort of skills and were they underpowered compared to other classes. So it was like they were unhappy with the game mechanic, basically. And they had been posting a lot about it on the forums, but they felt like nobody's really taken us seriously. So we're going to up the ante and have a demonstration.
Demonstration to the game designers?
Yeah. To sort of say, you need to kind of take our concerns seriously. Pay attention to what we're saying.
The interesting thing about that, though, is that often this happens in MMOs after they've been out for about a year or so.
Yeah.
The designers go through what they call a combat upgrade or
Right.
whatever. And then there's all sorts of complaints after the fact because the players are getting what they wanted, but it's not what they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The other, recently there was a sort of non-game mechanic issue that happened where Blizzard, there was a gay, lesbian, bi, trans friendly guild that was advertising. Do people know about this story? That was advertising in World of Warcraft and got told you can't do that because sexual orientation is deemed a bit too provocative and we don't want to set people off. And so they were told they couldn't do this. There went a lot of protest and back and forth in the player community, and players are very divided about these issues. You should bring in real-life things. You shouldn't. The irony, of course, is everybody does all the time. But you should, you shouldn't. And in the end, Blizzard actually revised their policy, but it was another moment, I think, where, the player community was doing one thing, the developers, the management sort of had a picture of what should happen, and it has to either be aligned or changed or reconciled in some way. And since all of you are, a lot of you are sort of in this world, so maybe I don't need to make this argument so much. It is sometimes the case that games are seen as this kind of side fringe thing, and it's sort of a nice diversion, but it's not particularly central to our culture or to the things that concern us more generally. I actually think it is. I think that the stuff that we see and can analyze and talk about in game culture hits to the heart of some of our big cultural debates right now about intellectual property, about the commodification of culture. I haven't had time to talk about it, but in my book I have a chapter where I look at people who are often called power gamers. They play in a way that seems like work, and for me they raise interesting questions for us about the status of leisure and work in our culture. Or women. What do we do with all the women playing these games? And our ideas about femininity and, who's a game player. So for me, while on the one hand these games are interesting to study in and of themselves, they're also incredibly illuminative for much broader cultural debates we have, and much broader debates we have about technology. Who are users? What should they be doing? Who gets the final say? How can we enlist? How can we enroll users as producers and designers in interesting ways? So I'll end there, and hopefully we can have sort of interesting discussion. I ran through quite a bit of stuff. Yeah.
I think to your point about the job aspect, right? One of the challenges right now is that there are companies all over the world, but a lot of them are in Asia, where they're actually paying people to make the gold that's being sold on these third-party sites.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they're making pennies a day, and they are playing around the clock to build up these incomes that they saw other players. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think players are really, there's a real division about how people understand, what's the real part of play? If I've got to grind for 11 hours to get an object that lets me go kill a monster, which part of that was the playful part? And a lot of people feel like bypassing the grind, it's a very, and I always think the interesting thing with what's often called the gold farming issue is it's like the prostitution thing. We spend a lot of time talking about prostitutes and not a lot of time talking about the guys who go to them. Like we're spending a lot of time, we're sort of, the gold farmers, well, what's happening that people are buying all that stuff? Like what's taking place in leisure and work and, right? Yeah, so it's a great issue. Yeah.
So it's really interesting to hear about the culture within the game. I've been playing role-playing text-based games since I was 7. I never quite graduated.
Well.
But I know that among my group, my society, as it were, on those games, there's a big, almost taboo about talking about that in real life. I met my boyfriend there, but when we tell people how we met for a mutual friend.
Right.
So I'm still kind of back in the early 90s and playing those kind of games. But as this stuff grows more and more, people are bringing their real lives into it. Have you noticed it's seeping into real life, as it were?
Well, certainly. Yeah, no, absolutely. When I was studying Everquest, I saw that phenomenon. I just saw Liz nodding because I think WoW. I was debating with myself about whether or not I think WoW really changes the demographics. At the very least, it scales them hugely. So it's. Maybe if Liz wants to say a few words, but this idea of people bringing in their family relationships, their friends, their coworkers. There's the phrase circulating around right now, which I cringe a little bit every time I hear it, but is the new WoW is the new golf, right? So yeah, I think that, and I think you're right. Like there was a moment where you didn't really often disclose where you met people because there was a little bit of stigma attached. I think if I could say one other thing, these are becoming mundane, everyday products. We are integrating them into our daily lives, just like we don't think our cell phones are particularly remarkable anymore, or our laptops or anything else. They become everyday technologies. And I guess part of one of my pitches for this, again, this is where I think anthropologists, sociologists, ethnographers, people who do user studies are really valuable. They're good at trying to understand everyday use, right? So maybe eventually you'll be a forerunner someday. Yeah, exactly. There was a hand up front, so yeah.
Well, I just want to make a little comment. I think the money and economic aspects of this are really fascinating. I was listening to NPR the other day, and they said that so much money is going into these virtual worlds and to buy the gold and so forth that economists are having to include that in their economic models of nations, or their models will be wrong.
Right. Yeah. No, it's interesting point.
Somebody tried to put a dollar amount on the value of real estate.
No, yeah. Yeah.
The realtors living off,
Yeah.
they just don't drive later.
Yeah. And if you're interested, I think probably one of the first people to hit on this was Ted Castronova. Released a paper a number of years ago, and he has a book out now, Synthetic Worlds, where he sort of compared the GDP of Norath, the world of Everquest, with all kinds of nations, and found, I forget the punchline. Was that Norath ahead of higher? Thank you. Yeah. So, Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, Julia Zabel has a book coming out in the next couple of months called Play Money.
Yeah.
At the real money transfer issues.
Yeah.
And he's drawn some heat recently because he actually called the IRS and went up the chain to talk about the barter issue. Because if you exchange goods in a virtual world, does the IRS consider that to be barter in the same way that if we exchange goods in the real world? By actually calling the IRS and pushing this all get an answer as to whether your gains in a virtual world are considered income. And so there's a lot happening in the States on both a legal and an economic level. And, you know, I'm happy to provide sites for people to and pointers to the folks doing research in the States right now.
There is a game that actually, like, you can take the gold that you make and the money and translate it in the game and translate it to real money.
There's and Entropia has
Entropia, there are some interesting questions surrounding that.
People are selling property for like hundreds of thousands of dollars, like real money.
Well,
and they release like
questions
bank cards now that will translate that. You can go to an ATM and translate that money.
It's worth looking at the Terra Nova blog for a recent post on Entropia for a lawyer's take on some of what's happening there, because some of that is smoke and mirrors.
I guess Second Life all about that as well, like there's a real economy that's actually...
Second Life is probably one of the biggest,
Second Life set up a stock market, so we tried to set up
They're very inventive over there. I don't know if I should get back to the hand.
When you have a culture like World of Warcraft, where you have Alliance and Horde, and both of them speak different languages, do you find that it benefits the game in the sense that you have this miscommunication going on, or do you find that it actually hurts the game through lack of social interaction?
I think one of the most interesting comments I read about this was at Terra Nova, where a guy said, you know, I used to play Everquest, and I wasn't really a big PvPer there. You know, people could talk to each other. And he says somehow, you know, in WoW, it's as if the other side has become a really smart NPC, non-player character. And he's actually said, he's become more of a kind of ganking PvPer because of that technological structure. And for me, that's the interesting question, is like, how do those systems set up or afford particular kinds of social performances? So I think it would be nice if they had at least allowed us to learn the other languages and built it into the game mechanic in some way.
Really interesting takeaway is if it's easier to kill someone that you can't speak with, then there's a real value to teaching more soldiers Arabic, like Louis Johnson's doing with.
It's an interesting point. There was.
Like I approach this like this is something that I'm not really involved in, but I can see it as something that my kids are going to do. It's going to be like the rock and roll. And you get to the aspect, especially talking to people that do play WoW a lot, there's this, I get this undercurrent that it's addictive. And how, at one point do you say, it's just too addictive, or no, not to make it, because it's going to happen. Anyway, people are going to play it, it's going to become bigger and bigger. And it's going to be, you know, a very fundamental part of the way people not even interact when they're on the computer, but out of the computer, because it'll be on mobile technology.
For me, the addiction language is, it sort of closes down the interesting stuff. So, I mean, I also think we have to be careful when gamers say they're addicted, it's often a substitute for being very hardcore. It's a way of sort of showing how engaged you are. So I think I just want to be cautious about, you know, if somebody says they're addicted to a game, what are they really, what does that mean, right?
But they actually probably are addicted to the game.
So then the next thing I would say, though, is for me the question then becomes, well, what's going on in those spaces to make them so compelling? What are people doing instead of it? Do we talk about sort of social life as addicting? Not usually. I mean, for me, I don't use that language mostly because I think we're still at the stage where there's lots of interesting stuff to understand about it, and when we put that label on it, we tend to just kind of shut down for me at least, we shut down all the interesting paths of research that are still kind of yet to be explored.
The boss and everything look at my kids. They like basketball or they like sports a lot. Well, okay. Not great. They go ahead their time as much as they want. But if there's so much time with games or concern, people feel like people are learning this. So you sound funny. But nobody skips eating or going to the bathroom and playing basketball. But people do it in the industry.
People get so engaged in other kinds of activities, outdoor activities, other kinds of things. Yeah, I mean, to say that doesn't happen with other activities, I think.
There was also...
they have an article in Scientific American where they actually compare watching TV and playing video games. Watching TV was the focus of the article, actually. And they compare heart rates and like hormone levels. It sounds funny, but it's actually, they do this. And because it's like, what's the difference between doing cocaine and playing basketball, right? Well, one of the things about exercise, you do it, and actually you go through a completely different hormonal change after you do exercise, as compared to watching TV or video games. They say it's even more pervasive, like after watching TV or playing video games or doing something like an addictive substance, your hormone level goes to what they call tanking.
Well,
which makes you want to go back.
Yeah. I've learned to. I've read enough bad science reports. I had to learn to be. But I mean, I guess I would say two things about the kids stuff. One is I think it's instructive to remember. When children's literature came out, there was a similar moral panic about it, where we were really worried kids were going to stay in the house and read all day, and they weren't going to go outside. So I think we should. Games are part of a much longer conversation we have about leisure and what people should be doing. But the other thing I would say is, if we look at this trend of families playing together and offline relationships, what it means to have your son or daughter in WoW may complicate the conversation if you're playing alongside them or you know about them. And again, people should read Liz's recent post at Terra Nova about this and sort of her son playing in WoW as well. So for me, we still have a lot we got to figure out before we head down the path of sort of bracketing it off in this way. I think there was a hand over here, but yeah, you were the one who had your hand.
Yeah, is there a takeaway for designers of social spaces from your book?
I'm sorry, once more?
Is there a takeaway for designers of social spaces, whether it's MMOGs or websites or even social entities? Well,
I think I am trying to provoke this idea of what does it mean to take players seriously as participatory. I'm not a designer. I just wrote a paper recently actually on participatory design for games, but I'm not a designer. But I do think this idea of how do you really take their everyday interventions and bring them into the process in meaningful ways. I mean, one of the unfortunate things that sometimes happen is when designers want to look to users, they do that at the end of the product, right, and not early on in sort of early iterative stages, or they don't confront the really hard thorny question, if they really want to share accounts, is there some way we can make that work? And is legal, can we sort of persuade? So I think I try to provoke this question of what does it mean for design and for these spaces to kind of take them seriously. Yeah, but I'm not a designer, so I don't quite say what the answer is in that regard. I think it was here, and then, yes.
I thought it was interesting, like, you were bringing screenshots of Ultima Online and World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
I don't play World of Warcraft, but I did play Ultima Online.
Okay,
I thought it was interesting that when that came out, the designers had a lot of control over what's happening. And then we started seeing the emergence of player communities, and over time, because people are smart, people banding, or people find ways to exploit resources of other people. Yeah. You now see games where player communities now dominate the entire structure of the game. So my question is, moving forward with these upcoming games, and along with the issues of the economics of it, the political structure, social structure, and everything, is it a massive concern, such as that we're kind of creating like caste systems in our online space, that where casual gamers would come in and they feel excluded because they don't have connections, they don't have those social networks that everyone else has, or they don't have the money, or they just don't have something.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Is that kind of a major concern for, I guess, researching these social networks, like that people feel excluded, kind of beat down, or just kind of automatically shut off because of either who they are or what they lack?
Yeah. I mean, I think designers in this genre definitely have been aware that they're not reaching maybe more casual players. I don't know that they've been worried about it for the reasons you suggest. I'm not sure that they're concerned about social stratification, which I think is an interesting, are you so outside that you can never get in? WoW is a kind of funny game in that way because you really can get by for a long time without joining a guild or formally grouping, but you do hit a point where you have to. And so then I think people often feel like the game has completely changed for me now, and is this the game that I've just spent the last 5 months with? So
I know other games like Final Fantasy 11, and that early on, you get to a point where you cancel, and it's almost like maybe after a couple of days you realize you have to band together.
Right.
That process can be, it might just from 2 years of playing, either can be just really
free flow.
Yeah.
It just lands on you.
Yeah.
Or it could be the most painful
Absolutely.
issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
In any game.
Yeah.
And so from that, I know that there's going to be a division of people that get in the parties really easily, and then people that just wait days.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of concerned about how do you deal with those people that are automatically excluded by the player-made systems, basically.
No, it's a good point. And I mean, I guess in that regard, these games have been amazingly dumb in not designing more tools for people to work with the networks they have and deal with community. I mean, if you look at how guilds, which are 100-person organizations at a high end, have to really be managed, there are inventories that have to be accounted for, and the games provide no tools for this stuff. I mean, it's a common thing, right? We have the technology, and then the social stuff is just going to get kind of maybe layered on later. But the games are very truncated in the social tools and technology and affordances they give people to actually manage that stuff. And I mean, whoever can revolutionize that. Yep, sure, okay. Okay, so I guess it was here and here then, yeah.
Have you played A Tale in the Desert? It feels to me that the designers specifically answered a lot of the issues.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the interesting ones because, but are you a Tale in the Desert player? Okay. I haven't played it. There's a lot more, I think, what would you call sort of player governance in that world, where people are kind of vying for leadership positions. On the other hand, the designer of that game plays a pretty active role in setting up scenarios and provoking things to happen. So he's very involved in that game and in kind of shaping it. And it is an interesting, even though there's all these people playing WoW, there are lots of great little alternate models out there circulating around. And that's one worth checking out, to be sure. Yeah. And then the last.
And just a question. I noticed that as the games evolve, it seems like on some level they're trying to bring in enough sense of realism that you can suspend just certain pieces of your belief. And that's what makes it interesting, bringing in economies and so forth. I noticed that one of the things that governs my social interaction in this life is the fact that I will die just one time. How much are people thinking about that in games?
Yeah.
Creating a game where you die
just once. It's a big debate. It's often called the permadeath issue, right? It's the kind of and I mean, the game design community talks about it a lot, and I think most of them just feel that players will never settle for that. It is one of the big debates. And if you're interested, I mean, Terra Nova is a great site to follow these discussions on at Massive Multiplayers, and there's also a long historic email list called the Mud Dev List, which goes back to Mud developers, but they debated a lot of the same stuff where you can kind of follow these discussions. So it's one of the big ones. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much.